there's enough help out there for people, like I say, like they're afraid to speak up, and what do you think can be done to better help those that are afraid to speak up?
There is a lot of support out there, but the resources third sector organisations, like local ones such as NIDAS or national ones like Women's Aid, have are reduced because of the higher number of calls that we've had across COVID time. So the calls that we're getting at third sector support organisations don't match the police data that has come out of this report, first of all. Secondly, to try and get a refuge bed now is incredibly difficult. And I know this is a priority area, but I think more funding needs to go this way, which would mean that there'd be more support in place for people. Domestic abuse has a massive impact on an individual and a family. So sometimes even when you've been getting support, so I had support from NIDAS for 5 years and then from the Angelou Centre. And even when you're getting that support, what I was trying to say in my blog was the impact is so widespread that almost you fall through the gaps. And that happens for victims a lot, that we fall through the gaps. And speaking out about it is incredibly difficult. It's still a taboo in our society to say that happened to me, even in these times. So if I would like to normalise talking about it, which is great to be here, to be able to talk about it, but also more funding going that way, and professionals understanding, experience and believing victims.
So I know you've just mentioned this quite briefly, and we've read your report about the personal reflection on domestic abuse, and you mentioned the shadow pandemic. Do you think this has had a ripple effect on domestic abuse? Obviously I know we're only like a year or two on from that, but do you think it's having a ripple effect on domestic abuse?
Yeah, it's massive, the effect of COVID on domestic abuse victims, because if they were being controlled before COVID, that's one thing, but in COVID it's a lot easier to know where people are, to track them, to not have them get access to their family and friends. And there's still a lag from that. We're still used to being in our homes, and when we're told be safe, stay at home, but our home isn't safe, then that brings up a lot of complexity for people. So I see it having quite a massive ability for people to be controlled more than they were before COVID.
Do you feel that the media as a whole fails to report on domestic abuse in general?
There's many issues with the media and how they report on domestic abuse. First of all, language. So often victims are not personalised, and the responsibility tends to be placed on the person who hasn't left. Why didn't she leave? That's the question we know is the status quo, rather than actually placing the responsibility on the person enacting the violence. We often see no names of victims, people who have been murdered, in headlines, and we'll often see it underreported as well. So there may be a headline, but then we don't really hear a lot more about it. And I don't think the media really shows the labyrinth that a victim has to try to navigate around getting help. So the focus is all on the escape, which you can understand that's the most dangerous time. It might take 10 times for that person to actually leave. It might take more. It took me many years, over a decade. And then once they've escaped, it's like, oh, they're free now. But actually, there's so much that happens after that isn't recognised. And I don't think the media does a very good job of showing that complex picture.
And just finally, it's quite a tricky one, but why do you think sort of emotional abuse is less sort of reported than physical abuse?
Yeah, it's a really important question though. So, for people who haven't been abused themselves, the easiest thing to recognise is a bruise, it's a scar, it's a hospital stay. Now, if you've never been in a situation where you've been gaslit, I know it's overused nowadays, that term, a place where someone's trying to make you feel crazy, where they're doubting what you've said and they're changing the narrative all the time, you would not possibly understand the impact that has on an individual and how it scrambles your head. And I think a lot of professionals in general really can't get their heads around why somebody would stay in a situation where that's happening. And it's so much easier for them to recognise that physical aspect. Whereas what they need to understand is it's done very slowly, and it's done to the point where you're so imbalanced that you think it's you rather than the other person enacting this emotional abuse. And you may be in a situation with kids, there may be financial implications, there's all kinds of reasons why you're really stuck and you're really trapped. But if you've never been there, the picture that has to be built up, you have to join a lot of dots up to see it. And often professionals don't have that time or resource to actually put them pieces together.
That's everything. Thank you very much.
You seem to be skeptical about the official figures. A 7.7% increase year on year up to 2022, a 1.7% decrease year on year in Northumbria. So do you think that these figures are quite conservative? In what way?
I think the figures are always conservative on the increase because they only capture the people who have had the courage after maybe many assaults or many situations to call the police in the first place. So it doesn't really give us the greater picture of how abuse is playing out. But I am sceptical about the figures for Northumbria. Northumbria is a really big region, and I know that the police officers have a wide remit around what they need to attend. And I did call the police in Northumbria. So I lived in Northumbria for a time, and then I lived in Newcastle. And each force has different cultural ways that they deal with things, even though they have procedures. And I'm just wondering, since there's an anomaly there, why is the anomaly there? It doesn't seem to me that people living, I think there's a lot of domestic abuse in rural communities, you're more isolated. So it doesn't make sense to me that the figures would be less for there. I'm not exactly sure why, but I am sceptical that this is really capturing the reality.
Can you take us a little bit through the process of reporting?
Yeah.
To the police? What happens in between the report being an incident and for that report to translate into an offence?
Yeah, everyone has a different story around this. It's not straight lined, it's not a linear process. So what tends to happen is you'll call the police. It may take days to speak to somebody unless there's been an emergency situation where they consider you in harm, and it may be they come a few days later and they take a statement from you, so you need to be able to give a statement. If you're not able to give a statement, some people don't want there to be an arrest or an offence. They were scared and they just wanted something for right there and then, which is a bit of a plaster rather than dealing with the core of it. But if you do want to make a statement, they take it. And now there's thresholds for different kinds of behaviours. So I can give an example of mine if it helps. I was ringing police from around 2009, and it wasn't until 2018 that there was an arrest, because it was always emotional, psychological. It was physical, so I'd been pushed around. I'd been made to try and leave a house, but when the police visited at that time, they said it was okay because it was someone just trying to remove me from the property. It was in front of children, so often they'll do a child concern notification. So it has to meet quite a high threshold, and I would say the threshold seems to be around physical. Now they do a DASH report, that's a questionnaire around, trying to tick the boxes around psychological, sexual, financial, animals. They'll ask you questions like, has that person ever hurt your animal? Have they ever withheld money from you? And they do this questionnaire. But I think you get really good police officers who get it, and usually, actually, the really good police officers have had a family member who've had an experience of it, or they specialise it in some way. Whereas I've had police officers who say things like, you're not black and blue, someone around the corner I just attended was really smashed up, so you're lucky. I've had comments like that. So first of all, there's a lack of understanding around what abuse looks like, I think. There's a lot of policy and procedure for them to put in place. But basically the time when there was an arrest, I've been in court, so I'm a specialist in family law court, people's experiences of that. And when the arrest happened, it was because he was sat out. I had a non-molestation order, so you can try and pursue it through the criminal courts if you're being harassed. I was being harassed by him after I'd left him. But what actually ended up happening was I went to court, and the solicitor that was appointed from the Crown Prosecution Service came to me just before it all happened, saying he's got texts from you where you're not very nice to him. So I would say to you, you better not go ahead with this. He's not going to be charged. And this is a key point, because often professionals don't understand you're in trauma and you may be reactive to that. So in order to get someone to leave you alone, you might send something in a message which a normal person wouldn't send. And then that abuser uses that against you again. So in that time, I was told, if you drop the conviction, we will give you a restraining order. And if you drop it, you'll get the terms of the restraining order to be what you want it to be. So I accepted that, I did. And I had that in place. And then that ran out, and I went through the family law court, so the civil kind of legislation stuff, and I had to go in front of a judge, an emergency hearing, one-to-one with a judge. I didn't have a solicitor, because that's another story, but often victims don't get access to legal aid because of their income or their roles. If you're a professional, they think you have enough money to pay for this representation. And I had to argue why I needed this order to be made that day. You have to fill a form out giving all of the abuse, and it's quite a difficult position to be in. You're in the judge's private office, really. They're behind a desk and you're there solo, and you're trying to convince them, and sometimes they can be quite condescending and say things like, well, if he brings you flowers, don't backtrack on this. I had that said to me, and that was quite hard to, receive. But the big difference between the family law and the criminal is, I think that in the criminal courts you tend to get more support for victims. You tend to get more compassion. You tend to be treated better. In the family law court, it's very acrimonious, and so it becomes a she said, he said situation, and it's often labelled parental conflict rather than the domestic abuse being recognised. So what happens is people get re-traumatised in that process. So if you have PTSD, which I do have PTSD, you're in such fear in those rooms, because all eyes are on you, and you've got social services involved, and you've got potentially CAFCAS, which is the children's service for the court, who do reports on your children. And everywhere you go and everything you do, it's almost like you've got a judge on your shoulder, thinking, can I do this? Can I do that? How should my hair be? I can't be too radical in how I look. You also can't talk about the proceedings. You can get into trouble, contempt of court. So I don't know if you know, but I wrote an article and I published it in Gender Work and Organisation, which is a journal in my research area. And I blacked out any identifying information so that no judge can come back to me and get me in that room and say, this is your punishment, basically. So what happens in these processes is you end up feeling quite silenced. Even when police have been called out and there's been an arrest, which there was, because I had a non-molestation order and he breached it by being outside my home for 8 hours with a mattress in the back of his car, with a pizza delivery. He was set up for the night. They took him away and they said he was really difficult and they were keeping him. And then a new person came on in the morning and said he was being charming, he was being reasonable. And this is the thing about abusers, and it's not gender specific, it's man or woman, or in between, is that they're very charming to professionals. They have a way with their words, and they will convince professionals often that it's the victim that's the abuser and that they haven't done anything. And I've seen this play out all through these years. So we've been separated 9 years, and I've seen that with social workers, I've seen that with support workers, I've seen it with barristers and solicitors, that the perpetrator has this way of being able to talk the talk and for people to disbelieve your own experience. They let him out the next morning, the police, when he was arrested. The only time I'd asked him for him to be arrested, so I never wanted him to be arrested. I always said, can you take him to the station? Can you have a chat with him? I don't want my kids to be there. I always engineered it so my kids were not going to be there, so they wouldn't see this happen, because I didn't want them to have more trauma after everything. And they let him out in the morning. He came back to my address, his car was there, and he continued. And that was New Year's Day, because it was New Year's Eve into New Year's Day. So I was with police officers for New Year's Eve into the turning of the clock, giving my statements. And on New Year's Day, we had a different set of police officers who were all like, it was his birthday. It's his birthday, he just wants to see his kids. Hand them over to him, come on. You know, and I was saying, no, it's not appropriate. I have an order and I have things in place. And so what I'm trying to say is it really depends on who the person is that's the professional. I think the police have got better across time. I think they're very under-resourced. It's really difficult. And I've been in classrooms with them now for around 3 years. I've spoken to around 500 police officers about domestic abuse. I do a session specifically around, I identify as a survivor and I do to them in the room. I'm very honest. And I tell them about my experiences, but I also talk about how trauma plays out. And they might see someone as being violent, they might see someone as being aggressive, or they might see someone not talking. And these are all trauma responses, the fight or flight, the freeze. And I try and help them to see that there's more to the picture than maybe they pick up on initially. So yeah, I do this work because it's very important, I think, to have these conversations.
And despite, the fact that the system persuades you to, not go ahead with pressing charges and so on, we see a reversal in the trends, so that the offences recorded have surpassed the incidents. That goes back to the year 1819 at the national level, and in Northumbria the year 1718, so a year before.
Yeah.
What is driving this?
I did ask the police officers about this in our last teaching session. They don't know how the offences are recorded. They don't know if it's repeat offences or not. So they weren't entirely sure about what the picture is. And I think that's the problem with stats. We do need the stats, but we also need to really have a handle on how this is compiled, what the picture is of victims in that area. And we need to understand their processes, criminal and civil, to really understand why, it may be offences were recorded higher, but what were the conviction rates, for example? Because conviction rates are quite low. We know that around sexual assault, like rape, but we also find it with domestic abuse, because, you're in a courtroom and there's a judge there. I didn't see the criminal judge because I was video linked, so I didn't actually get to see them face to face. But in the family law court, I've seen many judges, probably about 20 now, maybe more. They often tell me they didn't have time to read the papers in front of them, so they don't read the detail. They have a very short amount of time, and they want to narrow everything to be very black and white, which is what the paper I wrote is about. It's like there's no room for the real person in the space. It's how do we reduce this complexity down to a way we can manage it, and often the domestic abuse is then taken out of it because they can't, even with evidence, say yes to this or no to that. What ends up happening often is people have fact-finding hearings in the family law court, and that can be anything from 3 days to 5 days. And what you're doing in that process, I didn't do it, and maybe it's good that I didn't, because what you're doing is presenting all your evidence, and that judge gets to tell you if it's true or not. Like, did that really happen or not? When you know it did. So, the stats do tell us some things, but the picture is much more deep and complex, I think.
And the interpretation of the official figures is that there is an increased willingness to report.
Yeah.
Is there a cultural change? Do you feel that is driving these official interpretations?
An interpretation of people being willing to report is a good thing. My take on the figures being low in general was always people were reluctant to report, actually. What I hear from the police officers in the room often is that there'll be the same people who are reporting. So there'll be a couple who are repeat reporters. One time it's that person, one time it's the other person, and that can make the data a bit skewed. But often they're trying to do things like victimless offences because the person doesn't want to. They just want the person to come and to take the police officer to come and take the other person away. They don't want to make a statement. So I think you've got a lot of different threads in that data, different experiences, different types of victims. From everyone I've spoken to, I'm in survivor groups on Facebook particularly, but I do a project as well where we're speaking directly to survivors. People are reluctant to report. People know how they might have, the impression you get when someone comes to your door for the first time and you've called them leaves quite a mark. So if that person's been helpful, great, you might be encouraged to ring again. But if you've had a negative experience, then you'd be less likely to, because you think, well, where's the help here? So
what do you do if you're in that situation?
Well, first of all, you have to identify that it is abuse. So if something's become really normal, that's the way you're living, that's what happens in your family, it can be very hard to see what's happening. As I said before, your vision's very clouded. You're like walking around in a fog, I would say. Then when you do get to the point where you realise it's not okay, you need to try and be believed. And that can be a process in itself, and get some support. And if you're still living with the person, this is all in secret, because if this person knows, it's dangerous. And then often people are finding, even post-separation, they're still dealing with a lot of abuse through child contact, financially. I only got my first maintenance payment for my kids 2 months ago. I've received no money for 4 children in the last 9 years. But it fits with the whole picture of what I lived. And I only now have the strength to, because I said in the blog, it's taken 9 years to feel normal. I feel like I'm myself again. So I've had the strength to do that. But reporting is a real scary minefield. And I think if people are really in an unsafe situation, they probably will keep trying. But I'm on groups where people try to leave and then they end up going back, where they call and they're not believed, where they call and it's more dangerous for them because they've called, like somebody's told the person, and there's kids involved. And who wants to leave their home with everything around them and go and live in a refuge? I mean, you leave everything behind. So you have to start all over again. And I think my saving grace is my job and my career, my identity. But if you didn't have any of that, and you had been leaning on the other person, or they'd been stopping you from having any money, then you're literally starting at ground zero again. And I think that makes it really difficult. So I don't really know what you say to someone when they don't want to report. I think it's a massive journey to take, and along the way you may gain some strength and be able to take another step, but you also might get stuck in certain places.
Dr. Hussein, we thank you very much for your generosity in talking to us. Is there anything that you would like to add?
Oh, I'd just like the opportunity to come and speak with you today, because I think that although it's really hard to write about, and it's hard to be out there as a survivor, it's like coming out of the closet in some way, it's a really good thing because it's healthy for us to talk about as a society, as an organisation, as students to lecturer, that this is happening. And so many people come to me when they read a blog or they read an article I've written and say, yeah, it's happened for me, and can we have a conversation? Because there's strength in numbers and you feel less alone. So thank you for giving me the space to come and talk about it today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.